In the late autumn of 1881, when the Appalachian Mountains were already wearing their early frost like a shroud of forgotten grief, the people of eastern Tennessee began speaking in lowered voices about something that had returned. Not a storm, not a sickness, but a memory that refused to stay buried. They called it many names depending on who was asked. The old women of the ridge said it was the mountain witch. The hunters called her the hollow woman. The preachers insisted she was nothing but a sin given shape by fear and isolation. But those who had seen her and lived never used any name at all afterward. They simply stopped speaking about that part of the mountains entirely. It began in a valley so narrow that sunlight only reached it for a few hours each day. The place was known as Black Hollow, though no map marked it and no government ever officially acknowledged its existence. The families there lived in scattered cabins carved into the forest edge, surviving on hunting, small crops, and whatever the mountain allowed them to keep. That winter, strange things began to happen before anyone saw her. Livestock stopped giving milk, even when their udders were full. Dogs refused to bark at night, instead whimpering and pressing themselves into corners as though hiding from something that had no shape. Children spoke of a woman standing at the edge of the woods, watching them with eyes that reflected no light at all. At first, the adults dismissed it. Appalachian life was built on hardship and superstition, and fear was as common as wood smoke. But then the death of Elijah Mercer changed the tone of the valley. Elijah was a woodcutter, strong and stubborn, a man who had laughed at ghost stories his entire life. He was found at the base of a pine ridge, his axe still clenched in his hand, though his body bore no wounds. His face, however, was frozen in a look of terror so intense that even the men who carried him refused to meet his eyes. There were no tracks around him. No signs of struggle, only a single circle of blackened soil where the snow refused to settle. That night, his widow claimed she heard someone whispering her husband's name from inside their chimney. When she looked up, she saw soot falling upward instead of down. After that, the stories multiplied. A child vanished near the creek and returned 3 days later speaking in a language no one recognized. A barn burned down without fire spreading to the trees around it. A preacher was found kneeling in his church, alive but completely blind, repeating the same phrase until his death, "She remembers what we buried." It was the schoolteacher, Miriam Calloway, who first wrote down the name that the valley would come to fear. She had come to Black Hollow only months earlier, a woman of education and stubborn curiosity, determined to bring literacy to a place that barely trusted outsiders. Unlike the others, she did not dismiss the stories. She listened, she wrote, and slowly, she began to notice a pattern beneath the fear. All accounts pointed to the same figure. A woman seen at the treeline. Always alone, always still, always watching. Miriam described her as impossibly tall, though not in a human way, as though her body remembers a height it no longer possesses. Her clothing was inconsistent across sightings. Sometimes it was a mourning dress from decades past. Sometimes it appeared as bark and woven moss. Once, a hunter swore she wore nothing at all, yet he could not recall any detail of her skin except that it seemed too dark to be natural and too smooth to belong to flesh. But it was her eyes that stayed consistent. They were described as hollow reflections, like water in a deep well that does not return light. The turning point came when Miriam decided to follow the stories into the woods herself. She left at dawn with a lantern, a notebook, and a refusal to believe that fear could govern reality. The villagers begged her not to go, but she had already made up her mind. The mountains, she believed, were only dangerous when misunderstood. She did not return that night. Or the next. On the third morning, she came back walking barefoot down the road that led into Black Hollow, her clothes untouched by dirt, her lantern extinguished but intact. She carried her notebook tightly against her chest as though it weighed more than paper should. When asked what she saw, she did not answer immediately. Instead, she sat at her desk in the schoolhouse and began writing rapidly, page after page, without pause. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but wrong, as though it belonged to someone who had learned how to imitate human speech but did not fully understand its purpose. "She is not new," Miriam said. "She is remembered." That night, she disappeared again, this time for good. But the notebook remained. Its pages described something that no longer fit into the idea of a woman at all. According to Miriam's final writings, the mountain witch was not a single being, but a continuation. A residue of something ancient that the land itself refused to forget. Long before the cabins, before the settlers, before even the names of rivers were spoken aloud, there had been a woman in the valley. Not a witch in the way stories describe, but something closer to a caretaker of thresholds between life and decay. She was said to know the language of roots, the memory held in bone, and the way grief could be stored in soil like seeds waiting to grow. The people she lived among did not understand her, and what is not understood is often feared. When famine came, they blamed her. When children died of fever, they said she had called sickness into the air. When storms destroyed their crops, they said she had spoken to the sky in a tongue meant to harm. And so they did what frightened communities have always done. They tried to remove what they could not control. The account in the notebook grows fragmented here, as though even writing it had begun to erode Miriam's clarity. It describes a night when the woman was taken into the woods by the very people she had once helped. Not one by one, but as a group, silent and certain. There was no trial, no judgment, only removal. They left her in a place where the forest grows too dense for sunlight and too quiet for birds. They buried her without markers, without prayers, and without names. But the land did not forget. According to the final pages, what returned was not her in the way she had been, but something shaped by memory alone. Something formed from the refusal of the earth to accept erasure. The mountain which, as she came to be called, was not revenge. She was continuity. After Miriam's disappearance, Black Hollow began to change more rapidly. Trees grew in unnatural patterns, forming shapes that looked almost deliberate when viewed from above. Streams shifted their courses overnight. Some cabins collapsed without whether or where, as if the ground beneath them had simply decided to stop supporting them. And people began to dream the same dream. In it, a woman stood in a forest that had no end. She did not speak, but her presence filled the mind like pressure. And always, in the dream, the viewer understood one simple truth: she was not coming closer. They were already inside her reach. By 1883, Black Hollow was abandoned. Those who left never spoke of it again, and those who tried to return found only dense forest where homes once stood. Even the paths were gone, as though the mountain had sealed itself shut. But the stories did not end. Travelers passing through the Appalachian region in later decades reported seeing a woman at the edge of forests that should not have contained her. Miners spoke of hearing footsteps in tunnels that had no exits. Hunter claimed their rifles would not fire when aimed into certain darkened thickets, as though the forest itself refused violence. And always, the description remained the same. A tall figure, still, watching. It was in the early 20th century that a preacher traveling through Tennessee wrote the most detailed account since Miriam's notebook. He had been skeptical of all superstition, determined to prove that fear was simply ignorance given voice. He spent 3 nights alone in the woods near an abandoned section of ridge where sightings were frequent. On the 3rd night, he wrote that he found her. Not emerging from the forest. Not approaching, but already present, as though she had been there long before he arrived and would remain long after he left. He described her not as a woman, but as an arrangement of presence. Something that resembled humanity only when viewed indirectly. When looked at directly, she seemed to lose definition, as if perception itself could not hold her together. The preacher attempted to speak scripture. It did not matter. He wrote that the words dissolved in his mouth before they could become sound. She did not move. She did not respond. But he understood, without knowing how, that she was not there to communicate. She was there to remember him. He fled before dawn and abandoned his ministry soon after. The final recorded encounter occurred in 1932, though many believe the presence has never ceased. A railway worker claimed to have seen her standing beside an unfinished track in the mountains, though when others arrived, there was no sign of construction, no tools, and no worker present. Only footprints in soft earth that led into the forest and stopped abruptly, as if whoever made them had stepped out of existence rather than walked away. Today, the legend of the Mountain Witch of Tennessee persists in fragments. In stories told around fires that burn a little too low. In warnings given to children who wander too far into the woods. In dreams that feel less like imagination and more like recall. Some say she is a curse born from injustice. Others say she is the memory of the land itself, refusing to let violence become forgotten. But there are those who believe something more unsettling. That she is not trapped in the past at all. That she moves forward whenever she is remembered. And that every retelling, every whisper, every attempt to explain her existence does not diminish her. It continues her. In the deepest parts of the Appalachian forest, where even modern maps blur into uncertainty, there are places where silence feels intentional. Where the wind does not behave like wind. Where standing still for too long creates the sensation of being observed by something that does not need to move in order to see. And in those places, if one listens carefully enough, there is sometimes a feeling, not a sound, not a vision, but a recognition, that something ancient is still keeping watch. Not out of anger, not out of mercy, but because it remembers. The forest did not end where the railway stopped being built. It simply swallowed it. By 1932, the abandoned tracks near the Tennessee ridges had become little more than scars in the earth, faint iron lines fading beneath moss, leaves, and decades of silence. Locals avoided the area not because of law or warning signs, but because something about it felt unfinished in a way that had nothing to do with construction. The railway worker who had first reported seeing her was never officially listed as missing. His name remained in records, but the man himself seemed to disappear from conversation as easily as he had from the forest. Those who knew him would later say it felt like remembering someone who had already been forgotten by reality itself. But the place where he was last seen did not forget. The trees around the old track bed grew in unnatural symmetry, bending inward slightly as though leaning to listen. Even during storms, the wind moved differently there, as if it was being redirected by something unseen. Animals refused to cross the broken rail line, circling around it instead, as though an invisible boundary had been drawn across the land. And in the center of it all, she remained. Not arriving, not leaving, simply continuing. There was no clear moment when she appeared. Those who claimed to have seen her could never agree on whether she stepped out of the fog or whether the fog itself simply decided to take shape. What was consistent, however, was her stillness. She stood where the railway had once been planned to extend deeper into the mountains, as if waiting for something that would never arrive. Her presence did not disturb the environment. It altered it in quieter ways. The air felt heavier in her direction. Sound seemed reluctant to travel too close. Time near her did not behave normally. A man walking through the ridge in 1934 claimed he lost several hours simply by passing within sight of her. He said he did not fall asleep, did not faint, did not stop moving. Yet when he reached the edge of the forest again, the sun had shifted, his shadow no longer matched his steps, and his watch had stopped entirely at the exact moment he had first seen her. He never returned to that area. But he did draw what he saw. In his sketch, later recovered from his belongings, the figure was not fully human. Not monstrous in the traditional sense, but incomplete in a way that suggested she was not meant to be captured by any single moment. Her outline appeared inconsistent, as if memory itself could not decide what shape she had. The face, however, was always the same. Empty. Not lacking features, but lacking definition, as though recognition itself refused to settle there. As years passed, more people reported similar encounters, though never in groups. The mountain witch, as she continued to be called in distant towns, seemed to exist only when observed alone. If more than one person was present, each would describe something slightly different, as if she adjusted herself to individual perception. Some saw mourning clothing, others saw roots and bark forming the shape of a body. A few saw nothing at all except a pressure in the air that made them feel watched without direction. But all accounts shared one unsettling detail. She never approached anyone. She did not chase, follow, or pursue. Instead, she remained fixed, as though her purpose was not movement but endurance. By the 1940s, folklore surrounding her had spread beyond Tennessee. Stories appeared in Appalachian newspapers, often dismissed as rural superstition, but the consistency of details made them difficult to fully ignore. Researchers who attempted to investigate the phenomenon often returned with little more than confusion, missing time, or a sudden reluctance to continue their work. One anthropologist who studied regional oral histories wrote a final note before abandoning his research. It is not that she is seen often. It is that she is remembered too clearly once seen. That idea became central to later interpretations. Because those who encountered her did not simply fear her. They retained her. Even decades later, they could describe her presence with unnatural precision, while struggling to recall details of their own lives during the same period. It was as if she anchored herself more strongly in memory than in physical space. The abandoned railway line continued to deteriorate, but something unusual happened around its midpoint. Surveyors in the 1950s noted that compasses behaved unpredictably near the old tracks. Photographs taken in the area often developed with dark, undefined shapes in the background, regardless of camera quality or lighting conditions. When examined closely, those shapes sometimes resembled a standing figure. Always facing the same direction. Always still. Modern interpretations of the legend suggest many explanations: psychological projection, environmental distortion, mass hysteria rooted in isolation. But none of these fully account for the consistency of independent reports across generations, or the peculiar similarity in descriptions from people who never shared contact with one another. There is one detail that appears in almost every credible account, regardless of time period or background. The feeling that she is not newly present, but continuously present, as though she is not something that arrives in places, but something that remains after everything else leaves. And so the abandoned railway, now fully reclaimed by forest, became more than a forgotten construction project. It became a threshold, a place where the boundary between memory and reality seemed thinner than elsewhere. Those who still travel near the Tennessee ridges sometimes say that if the fog is thick enough, and the forest is quiet enough, and a person stands still long enough without expectation, there is a moment where perception shifts. Not dramatically, not visibly, but enough to make the mind question whether the stillness between the trees is natural or aware. And in that uncertainty, the story of the mountain witch continues without needing to be spoken aloud. In the years that followed, the forest around the old Tennessee Railway grew even denser, as if it was deliberately sealing itself off from human understanding. Paths that once existed on maps were no longer traceable on foot. Even the memory of where to enter the ridge began to fade from those who once traveled it regularly. By the 1960s, the area had been officially marked as uninhabited wilderness, though locals knew that was only a formal way of admitting what had already been true for decades. No one built there anymore. No one stayed there longer than necessary. And those who did pass through often reported the same quiet discomfort, as if the land itself was observing them without effort. But the stories did not remain in the past. They adapted. A group of hikers in 1967 claimed they found the old railway line again, though it appeared in a different condition than historical records suggested. The tracks were not simply rusted or broken. They were partially submerged beneath soil in places where erosion should not have allowed it, as if the ground had risen to meet them rather than the tracks sinking over time. The group consisted of 4 people. Only 3 returned. The survivors never gave a consistent explanation for what happened to the 4th. One said he simply stopped walking and refused to continue. Another said he was standing beside the track one moment and no longer there the next. The third refused to speak about it entirely. But all 3 agreed on one thing. They had seen her. Not approaching them, not interacting with them, just present at the edge of visibility, as though she had always been waiting for someone in that exact configuration of space and time. After that incident, interest in the area briefly increased among researchers studying Appalachian folklore. One university team attempted to document the location scientifically. They brought equipment, recording devices, and detailed mapping tools. Their final field report was never formally published. What remains of it describes interference in audio recordings whenever the team entered a specific radius near the old track bed. Voices on tape would distort into low, uneven tones that did not match human speech patterns. Visual recordings, when played back, showed slight inconsistencies in shadow placement, particularly in areas where no physical source of obstruction existed. At one point in the documentation, a researcher noted, "The environment appears to respond to attention. The more we observe, the less stable it becomes." On the 7th day of their expedition, the team abruptly withdrew. No official reason was given. But privately, one member wrote a letter that was later discovered among personal effects. In it, he described a moment during their stay when all instruments simultaneously failed. No power, no signal, no environmental explanation, and in that silence, he said, they heard something that could not be located in space. Not a voice speaking to them, but a recognition of being seen in return. After that, the region was left largely alone again. Decades passed. Technology advanced. Maps became more precise. Satellites observed what humans could not reach easily. Yet even satellite imaging of the ridge showed something unusual. An area of inconsistent clarity where tree density appeared to shift slightly between scans taken at different times. Nothing dramatic enough to suggest movement, but enough to make consistent mapping unreliable. Some analysts dismissed it as atmospheric distortion. Others simply avoided labeling it at all. Locally, the older generation continued to tell the story in quieter forms. Not as entertainment, but as warning. Not as myth, but as something closer to inherited caution. They said the mountain witch was not bound to one place anymore. Only to one pattern: stillness, memory, observation, and that wherever those 3 conditions aligned, where a person stood alone in deep forest silence long enough to forget their surroundings, they might become aware of something already aware of them. Not suddenly, not violently, but gradually, as if realizing that the silence had never been empty. Only patient. There are newer reports even in recent years, though they are rarely written down formally. Cell phone recordings with inexplicable interference. Hikers reporting a figure that does not move when looked at directly, but feels closer when not watched. A sense of being accompanied without sound or presence. And always, when descriptions are compared, they return to the same image. A tall shape, still, waiting in a way that does not imply expectation, but continuation, as if nothing about her has ever ended, only persisted beyond the ability of time to correct it. And in the deepest parts of the Appalachian forest, where modern trails fade into older silence, the feeling remains unchanged. That the mountain is not empty. It is remembering. By the early 2000s, the legend of the mountain witch had shifted again, no longer confined to Appalachian folklore or rural storytelling circles. It had become something quieter and more widespread, appearing in fragmented accounts across digital forums, travel blogs, and anonymous posts that always seemed to vanish after a short time. The internet gave the story a new form, but not a new origin. People from different states, even different countries, began describing similar experiences after visiting remote wooded areas. The details varied, but the structure remained eerily consistent. A deep forest, sudden silence, an unexplained sense of being observed, and a single figure standing at a distance that never changed no matter how long it was watched. Some called it coincidence, others called it psychological suggestion. But those who had seen it up close rarely used either explanation. In Tennessee, near the forgotten ridge where the old railway once cut through the mountains, a series of unofficial investigations began again. Not by institutions this time, but by individuals drawn to the area through curiosity or obsession. Most went alone. Some left recordings. A few left nothing at all. One of the more documented cases involved a photographer who had spent years capturing abandoned places. He arrived with professional equipment, determined to document what he believed was an exaggerated myth. His first images showed nothing unusual. Trees, fog, broken land. But as he moved deeper toward the old railway path, the photographs began to change in subtle ways. Not dramatically altered, but inconsistent. A shadow appearing in frames where no figure was present during the shot. A distortion of light that suggested a vertical form just beyond the edge of visibility. He noted in his journal that the forest felt less like terrain and more like attention. On his final day in the area, he set up a stationary camera facing the overgrown tracks and left it running overnight. When he returned the next morning, the camera was still intact. The footage, however, contained something unexpected. For most of the recording, nothing appeared. Only wind, shifting branches, and fog moving in slow cycles across the ground. But at a precise moment, just after midnight, the motion in the frame stopped changing naturally. The trees remained still, even as the wind continued. Then, at the center of the frame, something darker than shadow became visible. A figure standing exactly where the railway had once been. It did not move toward the camera. It did not react to it. It simply remained in place, as if its presence was not dependent on observation but indifferent to it. The photographer reportedly watched the footage repeatedly, unable to determine whether the figure was approaching or whether perception itself was becoming unreliable. He never released the full recording. Shortly after returning from Tennessee, he abandoned his work and relocated without explanation. Friends later said he avoided all discussion of the trip and would visibly change subject whenever the forest was mentioned. In his absence, the legend continued to evolve without him. By this point, the mountain witch was no longer described solely as a haunting presence tied to a single valley. Instead, she had become a kind of pattern recognized in multiple regions of deep wilderness. A consistency in how human perception behaves when isolated long enough in environments that resist familiarity. Some researchers proposed that the phenomenon was not a being at all, but a shared psychological structure triggered by extreme isolation and environmental monotony. Others argued the opposite, that repeated reports across generations and geography suggested something external and persistent. But neither explanation fully accounted for the most disturbing aspect of all accounts. The feeling. That recognition was mutual. That whatever stood in the forest was not simply being seen. It was also seeing in return in a way that did not depend on direction or eye contact. In Tennessee, older residents still refused to enter certain parts of the ridge alone. Not out of superstition, but out of something closer to inherited certainty. They say the forest there behaves differently when unaccompanied. Not dangerous in a physical sense, but attentive in a way that makes people aware of themselves more than their surroundings. And that awareness, according to them, is what makes it dangerous. Because once noticed, it does not fade quickly. It lingers, as if something has recorded the moment internally and continues to hold it long after the person has left. Even today, hikers occasionally report losing time near the old railway site. GPS signals weaken without clear reason. Sounds become difficult to place in direction. And in rare cases, individuals claim they felt unable to determine whether they were walking deeper into the forest or circling within it. But the most consistent detail remains unchanged across all modern accounts. At some point, always at the edge of awareness rather than sight, there is a moment when the forest feels occupied by something that does not need to move to remain present. Something that does not hide, but simply continues existing in a way that cannot be ignored once noticed. And in those moments, the story does not feel like history. It feels like continuity, as though nothing ever truly began, only remained. In the most recent accounts, those recorded not in journals or field notes, but in fragmented voice recordings, anonymous posts, and damaged digital files, the mountain witch is no longer described as something that appears. She is described as something that stabilizes. A pattern that becomes clearer the longer someone stays within certain regions of the Appalachian wilderness, especially near older, less traveled ridges where human infrastructure once existed and then slowly surrendered to nature. One such account came from a man who attempted a solo expedition near the remnants of the Tennessee railway line in the late 2010s. His intention, according to his initial recordings, was simple documentation. He wanted to prove that the myth had no physical basis, that all sightings could be explained through misinterpretation, fatigue, or environmental illusion. His early recordings were calm, methodical. He described the forest in technical terms: humidity levels, visibility, terrain difficulty, sound dispersion. Then, at some point during the third day, the tone shifted. He noted that the silence in the forest had become structured, as if it followed rules rather than absence. He stopped hearing distant birds. Wind patterns became inconsistent. Even his own footsteps seemed to lose definition in playback. On the fourth day, he recorded something that was never fully explained. He was speaking normally when he suddenly paused mid-sentence. There was no sound of distress, no abrupt interruption. Only a silence that lasted several seconds longer than would be expected. Then he said, "It's not that she is closer. It's that distance is no longer measuring correctly." After that entry, all recordings became unstable. Segments of audio contained overlapping versions of his voice, speaking phrases he did not appear to be saying in real time. Some of these fragments repeated descriptions of standing still, of waiting, of something, remembering him more clearly than he remembered himself. The final recording recovered from his device is incomplete. It shows only a fixed view of forest ground, angled slightly upward as if the camera had been dropped or placed deliberately. For several minutes, there is only ambient noise. No movement, no identifiable change. Then, slowly, the sound of breathing begins, not from the recorder, but as if the environment itself is producing it. The breathing does not approach. It does not retreat. It simply exists within the audio space, layered beneath the natural sounds like a second atmosphere. At the end of the recording, the forest noise abruptly ceases. Not fades, stops. And in that absence, a single detail becomes noticeable: the sound of something standing without shifting weight, without fabric movement, without interaction with ground or air. Just presence. After that point, the file corrupts. No further data could be recovered. When search teams later entered the area, they found his equipment abandoned but intact. The camera had not been damaged. The battery was still functional. Yet all stored data beyond a certain timestamp had been overwritten with blank segments. No explanation was ever agreed upon. But among those familiar with the region, there was little surprise. Because the pattern, by then, was already familiar. Initial skepticism, careful observation, subtle anomalies, then a shift in perception where the environment itself seemed to begin participating in awareness. And finally, absence, not of the person, but of anything that could definitively explain what had occurred. Local residents continued to insist that the mountain witch was not something that travels or hunts. Instead, they describe her as something that remains where attention becomes too quiet. A condition rather than a creature. A continuity of presence that does not depend on physical form, but on the existence of someone noticing too deeply for too long. In recent years, some psychologists studying environmental perception have suggested that prolonged exposure to isolated natural environments can alter cognitive mapping, creating persistent internal representations that feel external. In simpler terms, the mind can generate stable presences in conditions of extreme solitude. But even within academic discussions, there is hesitation when addressing the consistency of Appalachian accounts specifically. Because while hallucinations vary widely between individuals, these reports do not. The descriptions remain fixed, tall, still, unmoving in a way that feels deliberate rather than passive, and always associated with locations where human presence once existed and then disappeared. Rail lines, abandoned cabins, forgotten logging paths, areas where construction began and never completed, places where intention once existed but was never resolved. As if those locations retained something unresolved within them. And in that unresolved space, the mountain witch continues to be described not as arriving, but as already being there before anyone notices. Even now, hikers who pass through deeper parts of the Tennessee ridges occasionally report a specific sensation that arrives without warning. A sudden awareness that their perception has become shared. That whatever they are observing is also capable of structuring what they see. They describe it not as fear in the immediate sense, but as a recognition that observation is no longer one-sided. And in those moments, some choose to leave immediately. Others continue walking, trying to rationalize the feeling. But a small number, according to scattered reports, stop entirely. Not because they are told to. Not because they are forced. But because continuing forward no longer feels like moving away from anything. Only deeper into something that has already been present for longer than they can measure. And in every version of the story, across every decade, every medium, every retelling, one detail remains unchanged: the forest does not introduce her. It only reveals her. And once revealed, she does not leave. She continues. After a certain point, the story of the mountain witch stopped behaving like a story at all. It began to resemble something closer to a condition of the land itself, something that existed regardless of whether it was believed, recorded, or denied. In the deepest parts of the Tennessee ridges, where modern maps thin out into blank green uncertainty, the idea of her presence became less about sightings and more about thresholds. People who lived near those regions started describing a subtle shift that had nothing to do with visuals or sound. It was a change in how space felt when no one else was around. A sense that the forest was no longer passive. That it held attention in return. One of the most unusual accounts came from a forestry worker in the early 2020s assigned to survey regrowth patterns near an abandoned section of land once used for logging access. His work was routine at first. Marking tree density, tracking soil erosion, documenting natural recovery. But on the second week, he began noticing inconsistencies in his measurements. Areas he had mapped as clear paths appeared obstructed the next day. Trees he was certain had been cut or fallen reappeared upright, too perfectly aligned to suggest natural regrowth. At first, he assumed equipment error. Then he stopped assuming anything. He recorded in his log that the forest did not feel static. It felt, aware of previous observation, as though it adjusted itself after being seen. On the 9th day, he reported something he initially hesitated to include in official documentation. While standing near a clearing close to the old railway corridor, he experienced a complete loss of ambient sound. Not gradual silence, but an immediate removal of all environmental noise, as if the world had been muted rather than quieted. In that silence, he said, he became aware of something he could not locate visually. He described it carefully in his report. There is a presence that does not interrupt the environment. It completes it. He did not see a figure. He did not hear movement. But he became certain that the clearing was no longer empty in the way unoccupied space is supposed to be. It was occupied in a manner that did not require form. After that day, he refused to return to the area alone. The official survey ended early, citing inconsistent terrain mapping and environmental anomalies not relevant to operational objectives. No further explanation was provided. Locally, however, the story persisted in a different form. Not as a warning of danger, but as an acknowledgement of limitation. People began to say that the mountain witch was not something that could be approached or studied directly, because direct engagement assumed separation between observer and observed. And in those woods, that separation was no longer guaranteed. She was described less as an entity and more as a response boundary. A point at which observation becomes mutual. Where looking is no longer passive. And being looked at is no longer reversible. This interpretation spread quietly through regional folklore, not replacing older versions of the story, but layering over them like sediment. The witch remained tall in description. Still, unmoving, located at thresholds, railways, clearings, abandoned paths. But the meaning behind her stillness shifted slightly with each generation. For older storytellers, she was memory. For newer ones, she was awareness. And for those who had come closest to describing her without contradiction, she was neither. She was continuity without origin. There are now digital archives that collect modern encounters, though most remain anonymous or unverifiable. One recurring pattern in these accounts is the gradual change in language used by those who experience the phenomenon. Initial descriptions are detailed, precise, grounded in sensory language. But as the accounts progress, language begins to lose spatial certainty. Words like here, there, distance, and movement become less frequent. They are replaced with terms like presence, shift, and recognition. It is as if the act of describing the experience slowly erodes the ability to define separation. One archived message, widely discussed among folklore researchers, ends with a single line before the account abruptly stops: "It doesn't follow me. It stays where I notice it." After that, no further messages were ever posted from that user. Whether the mountain witch exists as a physical entity, a psychological projection, or something entirely outside both categories remains unresolved. But the consistency of reports across time, geography, and technological medium continues to challenge simple explanation. What remains constant is not her form, but her effect. A shift in perception that occurs when isolation becomes deep enough that the mind stops distinguishing between environment and observer. And in that state, something else becomes noticeable. Not movement, not sound, but the realization that attention itself is no longer one-directional. That whatever stands in the forest is not waiting to be found. It is already engaged in the act of remembering those who enter. And once that memory begins, it does not seem to end when the person leaves. It continues quietly, in places where no one is looking directly. In forests that feel slightly too aware of silence. In ridges where fog settles with intention. In abandoned paths that seem to persist even when erased. And in those rare moments when everything becomes still enough to notice it again, the story does not feel like something being told. It feels like something still happening. By the late 2020s, something unexpected began to happen to the story itself. It stopped staying in one form. Earlier records, handwritten notes, oral accounts, newspaper fragments, had always shared a consistent core. A forest, a still figure, a sense of mutual awareness. But newer accounts, especially those recorded on digital devices in isolated regions of the Appalachian Range, began to diverge in a subtle but unsettling way. The mountain witch was no longer described only as being seen. In some reports, she was described as being noticed in hindsight. In others, she was never directly referenced at all, yet her presence was implied in missing segments of memory, corrupted footage, or gaps in recorded time where something clearly should have occurred but did not. One of the more carefully documented cases came from a field researcher studying environmental acoustics in remote Tennessee woodland zones. His work involved recording baseline sound profiles of untouched forest environments for comparison with urban noise pollution models. At first, his recordings were unremarkable. Wind patterns, insect activity, distant bird calls, the expected structure of a living ecosystem. But over time, he began noticing something unusual in the audio spectrum. Certain frequencies, typically associated with low-level environmental noise, were gradually stabilizing into repeating patterns. Not rhythmic in the musical sense, but consistent in structure, as though the forest itself was producing a form of organized silence. He wrote in his field notes, "It is not absence of sound. It is sound that refuses variation." On the 5th week of his study, he placed multiple microphones across a narrow valley believed to be near the historical path of the old railway line. He intended to compare audio variance across distance. That night, all devices recorded the same anomaly. At precisely the same moment, every microphone captured a sustained period of absolute acoustic flattening. Not silence caused by lack of input, but the removal of environmental unpredictability. Then, at the center of that uniformity, a single recurring pattern appeared. A low, steady pressure in the audio field that did not match wind, animal movement, or equipment interference. When analyzed later, technicians could not identify its origin. It did not behave like a sound source. It behaved like a sustained condition applied to the recording environment itself. The researcher attempted to replicate the phenomenon. He returned alone 2 days later. He did not file a second report. His equipment was later found intact, positioned carefully in a line facing the valley floor. Batteries functional. Memory storage partially erased. The remaining data contained only fragments. Among them, one short audio segment, approximately 12 seconds long, captured no identifiable speech. But embedded within it was something unusual, the ambient forest noise subtly reorganizing itself around a single unmoving point of reference. As if the environment had adjusted its behavior around something stationary. Not responding. Accommodating. After this incident, interest from academic circles declined, not because of resolution, but because of lack of reproducibility. No controlled study ever produced consistent results. The phenomenon resisted measurement, as though it only existed under conditions that collapsed under observation. However, in regional oral tradition, the interpretation became simpler over time. The mountain witch was no longer just a figure tied to a specific historical injustice or localized haunting. She was increasingly described as a persistent configuration, a state the forest enters under certain conditions of solitude, memory density, and prolonged human absence. Older storytellers resisted this terminology, preferring the traditional narrative of a singular presence. But, even they acknowledged a change in how the story behaved when told repeatedly in the same location. It was said that if the story was spoken in deep forest silence, especially near areas where human paths had been abandoned for long enough, listeners sometimes experienced a shift in perception afterward. Not visual hallucination, not auditory illusion, but a lingering sense that the environment had become slightly more attentive than before. And that something within it had registered the telling. In one of the final documented folk recordings from the region, an elderly resident described it in a way that would later be frequently quoted in research papers on environmental perception: "She is not in the woods like an animal or a spirit. She is what the woods become when you stay too long and forget you are being observed." This interpretation introduced a new layer to the myth. Not as a warning of supernatural danger, but as an inversion of perception itself. The idea that observation is not exclusive to sentient beings, but something that can emerge in environments under sustained attention. In this framing, the mountain witch was not chasing, appearing, or haunting. She was the residual effect of being noticed in a place that does not normally remain noticed. And once that effect exists, it does not easily dissolve. Even in modern times, hikers and researchers continue to report subtle anomalies in remote Appalachian zones, brief losses of directional certainty, moments where distance feels inconsistent, and an occasional sensation that turning away from a particular direction does not reduce awareness of what lies behind. These experiences are often dismissed individually. But collectively, they form a pattern that remains difficult to ignore. Because across decades, technologies, and interpretations, one element remains unchanged. The sense that something in those forests does not simply exist. It persists in relation to being perceived. And once perceived, it does not return to absence in the way other things do. It remains, quietly, in the structure of attention itself. Waiting not in time, but awareness. After years of scattered reports, something shifted again in how the story was being told. It was no longer confined to Appalachia, no longer anchored strictly to Tennessee ridges or abandoned railway lines. Accounts began appearing from entirely different landscapes: dense forests in Europe, remote woodlands in eastern Canada, even isolated mountain regions in Asia. The environments changed, but the structure of the experience did not. A quiet space. A moment of unnatural stillness. A sensation that perception itself had become shared. And always, somewhere within that structure, the same figure was implied. Not always seen, but consistently understood. Researchers who attempted to track these cross-regional reports noticed something unsettling: the descriptions did not converge through cultural storytelling. They converged through independent experience. People who had no access to Appalachian folklore still described the same sequence of perception shifts, as though the phenomenon was not being transmitted socially, but replicated cognitively under similar conditions. One cognitive study conducted in isolation chambers attempted to simulate extreme environmental solitude. Participants were placed in controlled forest-like sensory environments with reduced sound variation and prolonged visual monotony. Most reported mild disorientation. A small subset reported something far more specific. They described the sensation that the environment begins to hold attention back. When asked to elaborate, participants struggled. Many said the feeling was not visual or auditory. It was structural, as though the boundary between observer and surroundings had weakened in a measurable way. One participant, in a post-experiment interview, gave a description that researchers later found difficult to classify: "It didn't feel like something appeared. It felt like something stopped needing to hide that it was already there." When pressed, they clarified they had seen no figure. Yet their behavioral data showed elevated stress responses consistent with perceived presence. No consensus explanation was reached. But the implications unsettled those who reviewed the study. Meanwhile, in the Appalachian region itself, older residents began noticing a change in how the story was being retold by younger generations. It was less often described as a warning or a myth, and more often as a kind of spatial phenomenon. Something embedded in certain landscapes under specific perceptual conditions. The term, mountain witch, remained, but its meaning continued to drift. In some interpretations, she was no longer a being at all. She was described as a recurring perception anchor. A point where human awareness, when sufficiently isolated, begins to stabilize into a shared externalized form. Not hallucination in the traditional sense, but structured perception collapse. A theory that suggested the mind, when deprived of environmental variation long enough, constructs a stable reference point for awareness, and that in certain landscapes, that reference point becomes universally similar across individuals. Still, this explanation never fully satisfied those who had experienced it directly. Because they insisted on one detail that theory could not easily account for: mutuality. The sense that whatever they were perceiving was not simply a product of their mind, but something that behaved as if it was also perceiving them. Not reacting, not responding, but registering. In the deeper sections of the Appalachian wilderness, particularly in areas far from maintained trails, there are still locations where hikers report an abrupt loss of narrative clarity. They describe walking for extended periods without reliable sense of direction, only to realize later that their path has subtly altered in ways they cannot reconstruct. Some report brief moments where the forest feels paused, as though all environmental processes are still functioning but no longer progressing. And in those moments, there is often a shared detail, though rarely spoken aloud in identical language, the feeling that if they were to stop completely and remain still long enough, something would also stop moving in response. Not approaching, not retreating, simply matching their stillness. And in that imagined equilibrium, the distinction between observer and observed becomes uncertain enough that people tend to leave quickly, without fully understanding why. What remains consistent across all modern interpretations is that the mountain witch, regardless of name, form, or explanation, is not experienced as a sudden intrusion. She is experienced as recognition that arrives too late to be considered new. As though the mind is not encountering her for the first time, but remembering her at the exact moment of perception. And in that recognition, the story continues without needing structure, documentation, or belief. Because in the places where it is still spoken, or quietly thought, or briefly sensed and then dismissed, there is a shared understanding that does not require agreement. Only experience. That somewhere in the stillness of those forests, perception itself does not remain neutral. It participates. And once it does not easily return to being alone.